So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Leeds Civic Trust. This is the third in your lunch hour talk for 2022. Can't believe that the next week's will be the last so soon. My name's Mark Parry, and with me is Dr. Kevin Grady. He'll be giving the lectures. We'll have a brief question and answer session at the end. So if you use the chat facility rather than the Q&A facility, it'll help us monitor the questions. We are recording this, so typically the recording will be available tomorrow morning, perhaps afternoon, and people can watch it in their own time. And you can access this by going onto the Leeds Civic Trust website. So today's talk is called Urban Rivalry, Emulation and Civic Pride, West Yorkshire Public Buildings from 1800 to 1840. The competition between towns and cities has always been particularly strong in Yorkshire and also in the north of England. This lecture looks at the lively rivalry between them in the provision of civic amenities during the late Georgian period. So it's over to you, Kevin.
Right, I shall attempt to share my screen and see what happens. Ah, yes. Right, so it's that one. Now, oops. All right, there we go. It's got us to the start. Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's great to know that you're out there, even if I can't see you. I'm delighted to be continuing my 15th annual series of Leeds in Your Lunch Hour lectures. Oh, I must just start my... I've started my kitchen timer because I like to have a warning to see how I'm getting on. Anyway, yes, so I'm delighted to be continuing my 15th annual series of Leeds in Your Lunch Hour lectures. And to begin with, I'd like to thank the Thorsby Society, the Leeds Local and Family History Library, the Leeds Museums and Galleries and Leeds Civic Trust for allowing me to use some of the images that you're going to see today. Now, as you know, the first two lectures have focused on the history of Briggate. And incidentally, if you missed either of those, you can see them by going to the link on the Leeds Civic Trust website, which will take you to them on YouTube. Today's lecture looks at the provision of public buildings in the West Riding of Yorkshire in terms of the provision of these buildings in the period 1800 to 1840 in the 12 most significant towns. Of course, that could be a bit debatable, but the 12 most prominent towns, I think. I've been giving these lectures for 15 years, and I've been conscious that the audience, both its size and its composition, has expanded, and that there've been new people coming into the lectures. So occasionally I have actually repeated lectures from earlier in the series. Well, this is certainly not the case today, because although I've given this lecture before, and once before, when I actually checked it to see, well, when was it, did I give it? It was actually 37 years ago. So it was rather astonishing. And it returns me to the subject of my first academic research. When I began my PhD in 1972, I was supervised by the doyen of Leeds historians, Professor Maurice Beresford, who you see on the right in this picture. When I did sufficiently well in my first degree in economic history to obtain a grant to do a PhD, Maurice suggested that I should perhaps study the provision of public buildings in Leeds in the Georgian and Victorian period. Well, I liked the idea, but I didn't want to become purely another member of what we used to refer to as Beresford Circus. That is, that Morris had a group of PhD students, about 6, slightly more, who were all researching various aspects of the history and development of Leeds. I wanted to be a bit different, so I rather rashly expanded my study and said, look, I will do the public building provision in the Georgian period for 12 towns in the West Riding. The net result of that was that it took me 8 years to finish my PhD, but hopefully it was worth it. And as you can see from the center of the picture, I was very pleased when the Thoresby Society in 1989 published the summary, well, of my PhD research. So that was extremely good. So today's lecture is looking at one aspect of what was my PhD thesis. The period from 1750 to 1840 was one of exceptional growth in the West Riding as its economy expanded. The Riding's two principal industries, that is textiles and metalwares, flourished in a manner and on a scale totally unprecedented. Today, of course, we refer to this period from 1750 to 1840 as the Industrial Revolution. But of course, the Industrial Revolution involved a lot more than the expansion of industry. There was a revolution in commercial institutions. There was a revolution in transport. And at the same time, there was in effect a revolution in agriculture. Of a special concern for today's lecture is that during this period, there was tremendous growth in towns in the period. It was spectacular growth in both the populations and the sizes of many towns, and notably in the West Riding. Now, this population tables looks at the growth of population in the 12 West Riding towns that I selected for my research. You can see that the populations of Leeds and Sheffield in particular grew very significantly in the second 50 years of the 18th century, both of them more than doubling in size and becoming really quite large towns for the period. At the same time, if you went into the period which we're looking at today from 1801 to 1840, you can see that the rate of growth of towns accelerated still further. Sheffield and Leeds, of course, were the big towns, effectively cities in this period, and their populations grew threefold. To Leeds, in case it grew to 88,000, Sheffield 68,000. At the same time, Bradford and Huddersfield in effect were the boom towns of the period in that they grew from really quite small size, you know, in the 6,000-7,000 bracket up to 34,000 and 25,000 respectively in just a 40-year period. So this was an enormous rate of growth. Huddersfield grew fourfold in size. Halifax next in the list. Halifax doubled in size, but not at such a great progress. And at the same time, at the lower end of the table, there were a group of towns that, although they grew, actually grew relatively slow pace. So Rotherham, Ripon, Knaresborough, and Pontefract. The net effect of all this was that the Industrial Revolution was a major shock to the systems of West Riding towns. Their amenities were swamped by the rising tide of population, and no sooner had they attempted to remedy a problem than population growth surged again, and their efforts were drowned. Now, in this table here, we see the increasing stock of the public buildings of these 12 towns. And in the table at the top there, you see that from 1700 to 1750, there was growth in the number of public buildings in the towns, and it grew almost by 50%, but it was still only attained a relatively small level. In the next 50 years, clearly there was a very significant surge, and the number of buildings grew. It didn't quite double, but it went up to 240. And then between 1800 and 1840, it jumped to 529. So there was a very big growth in the period that we're looking at today. There you are. In particular, in the from 1820 to 1840, there was a dramatic increase in the stock of buildings. There were 354 additional buildings or amenities, you might say, provided in this period, of which 262 were purpose-built. And of the total, 289 of the buildings, either built or newly adopted, were new amenities of a different sort to those that had been there before. The rest of the buildings were effectively amenities that had existed in 1800 but acquired new buildings. So we have these phases of development. From 1750 to 1790, the towns were confronted with these rapid growth, and what were they to do? And they coped with the issue either by enlarging existing amenities or providing more amenities of the type that they'd been used to. There were a few new types of amenities, but not very many. So effectively, it was a holding operation that they'd embarked upon. By 1800, however, people accepted that urban growth was likely to go on quite rapidly, and therefore they thought that in the foreseeable future they were going to have to be much bolder in the actions they would take. Well, their enthusiasm was quashed in a way by the uncertainties of the Napoleonic Wars, but from 1815 onwards, the pent-up demand for new facilities of all sorts was released. And so between 1820 and 1830, 1840, there were all sorts of new facilities provided. Now, in studying the buildings, I was especially struck by the way in which the provision of institutions facilities spread from town to town. In other words, there was emulation going on, but equally I was struck by the rivalry within towns and between towns, which prompted the provision of buildings. And that called forth the title for my lecture about urban rivalry and emulation. But before we go on to the buildings themselves, I'd like to have a quick look at some of the towns themselves. Well, here we have Leeds, which of course really was by 1831 a significant and large industrial city. And as we've seen, its population had jumped to 88,000. Leeds, of course, its industries were based on textiles, cloth marketing, cloth manufacturing in factories, and of course the engineering industries which flourished in the late Georgian period. Sheffield, in contrast, experienced very similar growth, but of course it was based on the metal industries. The cutlers of Sheffield were famed in the 18th century. Their activities expanded. Of course, you get the production of iron and steel in the town as well. And so it grew dramatically and was very important. And you contrast the rather bucolic view of it in 1820 with the later view on the left-hand side. Bradford, as I've said, was the boom town of the period. We see it in the picture on the bottom right there, showing it in the late 18th century, a quiet but pleasant town, population of only about 6,000. By 1840, it had surged up 33,000, 34,000, and what was going on to be the great textile town, cloth making town, but in the worsted industry, which it became in the Victorian period. So it started out life as a worsted cloth producing town, few merchants really, a manufacturing centre. Huddersfield, like Bradford, also boomed in an extraordinary way in this period. You see on the right there how it looked in 1800, you know, a substantial market town. But by the 1830s, 1840s, this was a big cloth producing centre with lots of factories. Halifax had been a rival of Leeds in the 17th century as a centre for cloth manufacture on the domestic system. It specialised in worsteds, but it was much slower than Leeds going into the factory manufacture of these things. Wakefield, an interesting place. I mean, it had been a town of considerable lineage. By 1700, it was effectively the county town of the West Riding. It had competed with cloth in the cloth marketing and cloth production with Leeds in the 18th century. And it was very important because it had a major cattle market, a corn market, and obviously a cloth market. But it was slower than Leeds to adopt factory production. Doncaster, primarily a market town on the Great North Road. It was said to have the biggest corn market in the north of England in the early 19th century, but essentially it was a genteel town. Rich people lived in the neighbourhoods. It was the centre for horse racing in the north of England, well, and certainly in Yorkshire with the famous St. Leger race, of course. Rotherham, oh, sorry, just go back there. Rotherham had been important in the Middle Ages for the production of textiles, but by the 18th century, it was essentially a market town. It did well and expanded later to do with its close association with Sheffield. And of course, it did have on its peripheries some major manufacturers of iron and steel. Ripon, it had been the largest producer of cloth in the West Riding in the Middle Ages, but that industry was effectively wiped out by the 1600s. It was an important ecclesiastical centre, of course, but by 1800 it was primarily a market town with a genteel population, but curiously, unlike Leeds, elected 2 MPs to Parliament. Pontefract was in a similar position in that it too, because of its historical associations, I think, elected 2 MPs to Parliament. Of course, it had got its castle. It was very important in the Middle Ages. It remained although it lost its role as the county town of the West Riding in the 17th century, and Wakefield effectively took it over, Pontefract remained the place where the county quarter sessions, the general quarter sessions for the county, were held throughout the period. So it had that status. It was a fashionable place to be. So we should move on. We now move on to look at the county buildings that were provided in this period. The most well-known of the West Riding county institutions was at Wakefield, and this was the West Riding House of Correction. We see it above as it was enlarged in the 1820s and in 1837. It was a very significant building. Indeed, it was impressive, and it was accommodating 600 prisoners. It was actually the largest county jail in England. So we had an impressive prison, but what of county courthouses? It was the provision of county courthouses in the early years of the 19th century, which is one of the principal features of the provision of public buildings in this period. The fact was that in 1800, the county had no courthouses of its own. The magistrates, when they went round holding quarter sessions, had to use local town halls or other premises, sometimes it was public houses, and they found these facilities often totally inadequate, uncomfortable, and quite unsuited for judicial business as that judicial business expanded with the growth of population. We have here 3 examples, I think, of town halls that they might have used. The Leeds Moot Hall, of course, we discussed last week. It was in a pretty tatty state, and it was here in 1800 in the upper floor that the county magistrates would have to meet, and they were not happy. If they went to Pontefract, of course, I've explained its importance in judicial terms. Pontefract had actually built a new town hall in 1785, which we see here, which actually was really quite an impressive building for the period. But if you went to Wakefield, for example, this was their town hall, the old Market Cross, and it is rather amazing that not the magistrates, but for local public official meetings of committees and things, people went up that central staircase through past the cellars of dairy products into a room in the dome of the building. When the magistrates came, they had to meet in one of the large local pubs. So the West Riding magistrates were not at all happy. They were totally fed up, and they decided that something needed to be done about it. And so they decided that they would erect a West Riding courthouse in Sheffield, which they would finance from the county rate. To their astonishment, it was ruled that using the county rate for the erection of courthouses was quite illegal. As a result of that, they decided to go to Parliament to get permission to finance the use of the county rate for the erection of courthouses. Well, I should have said, by the way, that Mrs. Allenson, the patron in Ripon, had provided this nice town hall in 1801, so they were all right there, but that was the exception. So they obtained the Act of Parliament in 1806, and the first of the county courthouses to be erected was this building in in Wakefield, which is still there today and will be familiar to some of you. The next courthouse to be built was the Sheffield Town Hall, which was opened in 1810, and this was financed by a combination of local funding with a contribution by the county rate. Here we have Leeds Courthouse, which was the next in line. This was opened in 1813, and like the building in Sheffield, this was financed again out of local funds and the county rate. And here we have Bradford, who got in the act rather later, because of course they were growing much faster, but from a small start. From a small start, but this building was erected in 1834. By the end of this period, then, we had a network of county courthouses. The other major innovation in the provision of county buildings was the erection of the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum at a cost of £40,000, a really expensive building. By 1800, the problems of caring for the mentally ill had reached a scale unsuitable for treatment at the parish level. Some people were sent by the parishes to some private asylums, but in the main, they were kept in the workhouse. In 1807, a parliamentary select committee condemned the system, and suggested that county asylums should be provided. As a result of 2 acts of Parliament, magistrates were empowered to erect county asylums. The West Riding Asylum here, which we see, was only the second to be erected in the country. Some of you, it became known as Stanley Royd Hospital, certainly in the present century, and it accommodated, as we see, 250 lunatics, as they were termed in those days. So it was extremely impressive. But setting aside the provision of these important county buildings, the most impressive aspect of the provision of public buildings in the first 4 decades of the 19th century was that the great majority of them were privately financed rather than being provided by local authorities. It is in this private finance that the spirit of rivalry between towns is very conspicuous. So I'm going to move on now to look at the provision of buildings for charitable purposes and places of worship. It was from the 1760s that notable public medical institutions began to be provided in the 12 West Riding towns. The first of these was the General Infirmary at Leeds, which, as you can see, are a very impressive looking building. The infirmary had been founded in 1767 in temporary accommodation, but opened these premises in 1771. £4,500 cost. It had beds for 27 people, which increased to 108 by the 1790s. Well, here is a photograph of the building before it was demolished. So we're looking at this, I think, probably in, around, I think sort of maybe the late Victorian period. And it was indeed rather impressive. Well, if you focus on this building and its size and its shape, you'll be not surprised to see that Sheffield, although later in on the Act, also responded to the need for hospital of some sort and put up this very splendid building, which opened in 1797. I should emphasize that both of these infirmaries, and indeed all medical institutions in this period, were financed and provided by charity, by donations and subscriptions. Undoubtedly, there was rivalry between Leeds and Sheffield in the medical sphere. And here we see in 1829 that Sheffield erected this very impressive building for its newly established medical school. It's fascinating looking at these buildings, and you look at the slight differences in style. Classical clearly was the style of architecture that was favored for these sort of buildings, and you just see the variations maybe in the use, is it Doric capitals? Here we've got Ionic pilasters with Ionic swirls at the top there. Anyway, the point was that Leeds also wanted to have a medical school, and it was not far behind, because in 1831, it established its own medical school in this building in East Parade in the town centre. The late Georgian period was one of great expansion in medical facilities, and they occurred in other towns as well. Here we have the Leeds House of Recovery, which was purpose-built and opened in 1804. This was a fever hospital, i.e. that's for people with contagious diseases. Infirmaries were established in 3 more towns in our period, and 9 dispensaries were set up too. For example, Halifax opened a dispensary in 1807. And the first stone of the new Halifax Infirmary and Dispensary were laid in 1836. Clearly, there was rivalry between towns. If you could not afford an infirmary, then you should at least set up a dispensary. That is, in effect, a walk-in medical clinic. This was, after all, a point of honour. In 1824, Bradford did not even have a dispensary. And so a correspondent to the local newspaper attempted to rally the efforts of his fellow townspeople in chauvinistic terms. He said, "Institutions of this kind are an honour to the towns in which they are supported. Bradford is the only wealthy manufacturing town hereabout in which such a one does not exist. And shall Wakefield, Huddersfield, and Halifax excel us? Our pride says nay." Well, people did respond, and Bradford Dispensary was built and opened in 1827, and later it opened and built an infirmary in 1840. The way in which townspeople looked about and emulated the provision of institutions in other towns, and their evident detailed knowledge of developments quite far afield, is demonstrated by the campaign to secure the building of what we see here is Huddersfield and Upper Agbrigg Infirmary, which opened in 1831. The large pamphlet produced in 1828 to promote this scheme gave examples of medical provisions scattered all over England. The provisions and cost were cited for towns such as Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, Lincoln, Hereford, Colchester, Durham, Taunton, Northampton, Newcastle upon Tyne, and many more. So this was the spur to make sure you did something in your own town. Another type of public building provided by charities and benevolent individuals was almshouses. Here we see Harrison's almshouses, old, long-established institutions, but often in our period or slightly earlier extended. So Harrison's Hospital in Leeds here was extended in the period from 1790 to 1817. Likewise, in Sheffield, the Shrewsbury Hospital or almshouse, which had been founded in 1666 for 20 poor people, this was rebuilt in very grand style, as we see here, in 1828 on Norfolk Road. The Leeds Harrison's Hospital does not survive today, but these almshouses in Sheffield certainly do. So if you have time to go down there, you should go and have a look at them. Well, a major area of public building activity between 1800 and 1840 was in the provision of schools. Until the 19th century, the education of children largely relied on the old established small grammar schools and charity schools, or being educated in private academies, which were of very dubious quality in terms of the education they provided. There was no provision at this stage for mass education. Here we see Leeds Grammar School, which was still operating in this building in 1840, and also the Fifis School in Rotherham, which was erected in 1776 by the local charitable trust. There was some attempt to improve facilities, and here we see this very, very splendid building that was provided for Bradford Grammar School in 1820, but it only had 50 pupils at a time when Bradford's population was 20,000. So this wasn't going to deal with the issue of a requirement for mass education. Well, the answer came to some degree with a novel solution in this period by the provision and establishment of national schools and Lancasterian schools. The idea of these schools were they were run on the monitorial basis. In other words, you crammed lots and lots of children in them. A teacher would teach the older pupils, the monitors, and the monitors would teach the younger children. The Lancastrian school in Wakefield, no doubt worked on the same principle. And it's important to say at this point that Lancastrian schools were non-denominational and non-conformist. On the other hand, the national schools were established by the Church of England, so there was a rivalry in the provision of these schools. Here we see the national school in Leeds, which was put up in 1813. It had 500 pupils, so this is large-scale production, as it were, and it was situated between the White Cloth Hall off Kirkgate and the parish church itself. And indeed, if I'd looked out of my office when I was director of Leeds Civic Trust, had this building still been there, I would have seen it out of my window. Overall, by 1840, there'd been 17 national schools provided in West Riding towns and 10 Lancastrian or British schools, as they were known. Well, let's move on to churches and chapels. 1800 to 1840 was a period of prolific church and chapel building. No less than 135 of them were provided in this period. Probably I should say chapels and churches, because there were many more non-conformist chapels built than there were Anglican churches. So there were 60 Methodist chapels built, 10 Baptist ones, 17 independent chapels, and only 20 Anglican churches. Here we have rivalry between particularly the non-conformists for who could have the biggest and best and most chapels. And here we see, here we have Wesley Methodist Chapel in Leeds, which was opened in 1813. Here is the Zion Chapel, an independent dissenters chapel, opened in 1819 in Halifax. Here we have the Brunswick Methodist Chapel in Leeds, which splendid chapel, which opened in 1825, well known for its impressive organ. We're back to Halifax, the Wesleyan Chapel in Broad Street, opened in 1829. These were impressive looking buildings, and a point was being made. Even more impressive here, we see Brunswick Wesleyan Chapel in Sheffield, opened in 1834. And on a smaller scale and rather plainer, we have the Methodist New Connection Chapel in Halifax. The Anglicans were very worried about this situation. Quite clearly, they were not keeping up. Occasionally, a benefactor would provide a miscellaneous church, but there were very few of them. The government were alarmed by unruliness in the new industrializing towns in this period, and they believed that if they could be brought to the church, then the working classes would be better behaved. The problem was, how were churches going to be financed? In 1818, it was calculated that in parishes with more than 4,000 inhabitants, accommodation was only sufficient for a quarter of them. So in 1818, Parliament passed an act which granted £1 million for the erection of Anglican churches in working class areas. As a result of what was called the Million Act, for obvious reasons, 3 Anglican churches or Million Act churches were erected in each of Leeds, Sheffield, and Huddersfield, and 1 was erected in Barnsley. This is in the 1820s. As we see, they came in at about £10,000 per church. Here we see St Mary's Quarry Hill and St Mark's Woodhouse in Leeds, and the third of the Leeds Million Act churches, Christ Church on Meadow Lane, just south of Leeds Bridge, which opened in 1826. All 3 were built over the same period. Sheffield, of course, had 3 Million Act churches, and here we see St Mary's, which opened in 1830. Well, moving on from churches, there were many other types of buildings that were provided. Clearly, people were willing to donate money for charitable institutions and places of worship, but other kinds of facilities were required. But until 1800, there was relative neglect of these. If you take, for example, in terms of markets, something like the provision of Halifax Peace Hall, a splendid building, was an exception. Likewise was the provision of the coloured or mixed cloth hall in Leeds in the mid-18th century. Other than cloth halls, by and large, the market facilities of towns were unimproved in the 18th century. You might get a market cross like this one erected in Pontefract in 1763. But if you were in Leeds, you know, shambles, as we saw last week, was underneath the moot hall. Otherwise, the markets were in uncovered areas. Well, lots of money was going to be needed to finance the provision of market facilities and other public buildings. And where was it to come from? In the 1820s and 30s, there was an absolute mania for setting up companies to provide public buildings of all sorts. And a strong force behind these company formations was rivalry between the towns. And if you actually analyze the process that was going on, essentially, Leeds looked to what was happening in Liverpool and Manchester. We're not talking about football here. This is provision of amenities. Leeds looked to Liverpool and Manchester for examples and thought it should try and keep up with them. Sheffield also followed Liverpool and Manchester, but also looked to Leeds to see what it was doing. And then the smaller West Riding towns followed what they saw happening in Leeds and Sheffield. The rivalry was no more conspicuous than in the provision of markets in Leeds. In 1822, a writer to the Leeds Intelligencer wondered what outsiders must think of the people of Leeds. He wrote, "Sir, the spirit of improvement, which happily seems now in progress, will, I trust, wipe off the justly merited reproach under which the town has so long laboured. The removal of the old butcher shambles will, I hope, be soon followed by other improvements consistent with the opulence and commercial importance of the town of Leeds, and no longer subject us to the scorn of visitors who wonder that with the advance of intelligence and general science, we have been negligent of those matters by which other large commercial institutions have facilitated the intercourse of strangers with their merchants." Well, the result was the erection of 3 markets, a bazaar and shambles, a corn exchange, and a merchants' exchange, all of which were provided in the 7 years following his letter. Here we see the hugely impressive South Market, which was opened in 1824. Here we see the Central Market, which was opened in 1827. Like the South Market, it had lots of shops, 67 shops, 56 stalls. It had a bazaar up on its balcony, and it incorporated also offices and a hotel. And this was big money. This is £30,000 at a point when you could buy a back-to-back house for £50. And this was invested in by people buying £50 shares. And then we have the commercial buildings here, the wonderful merchant exchange, which I talked about in a lecture last year, which included an exchange, a newsroom, a concert room, offices, a hotel, and cost £34,000, again financed by £50 shares. It had this splendid newsroom, which, you know, was of a quality that was totally unprecedented in Leeds. There we have the Corn Exchange. But we move on now to the issue of great provision for grain sales. As we saw last week, this Corn Exchange was erected in Leeds in 1828, financed in the way we've just seen. But what happened in other towns? Well, companies were formed in Rotherham for its new marketplace, in Halifax for its new marketplace in 1810. There was a new marketplace erected at Bradford, but provided by the Lord of the Manor in the 1820s. And likewise in Sheffield, a new corn exchange was erected, but financed by a local magnate. Seeing all this happening, Wakefield must have felt that it needed to pull its socks up, particularly because it had one of the largest corn markets in the West Riding. In 1836, its inhabitants were clearly becoming ashamed of the position and of its facilities. And a group of people wrote to the local newspaper again saying, "It has long been the surprise of strangers that the frequenters of Wakefield Corn Market should be so much exposed to the casualties of the weather and other unfavourable circumstances, and it is generally admitted that no market in the kingdom of half its size or importance is so inadequately provided with accommodation." And the result was the Wakefield Corn Exchange, which we see here, which opened in 1840. Sadly, this building does not survive, but what a pity for Wakefield that it was demolished. Well, beyond trade and commerce, not everything, beyond trade and commerce, not everything was to townspeople's liking, because the town's status was reflected, particularly in its upper echelons, by the question of provision of cultural facilities. Libraries had been provided in some of the West Riding towns, the most notable of them being the Leeds Library in Commercial Street, Leeds, which was financed, as we can see, at a cost of £5,000 by £100 bonds. But some people were beginning to think of beyond libraries. A correspondent to the Leeds Mercury in 1818 commented, "It has long been the subject of surprise to me, and I believe to many others, that although the town of Leeds is justly celebrated for the number of its benevolent and humane institutions, it can boast of no society for the promotion of intellectual and literary improvement. There are few large towns where such institutions do not exist or flourish, and they are patronized in many places much less considerable in extent and much less respectable in character of the inhabitants than in the town of Leeds." So he was really telling them. The result was this building, the Philosophical Society, which say the Philosophical and Literary Society, was established in Leeds. And in 1820, they opened this absolutely splendid building at a cost of £7,000. It had a museum, it had a library, it had a lecture room, it had laboratories. And of course, some of you, if you're old enough, will vaguely remember that once upon a time, this had become the city museum. The provision of this institution now put Wakefield in the shade, as a Wakefield man pointed out to its inhabitants in 1820. The town of Leeds, originally of no greater extent or importance than Wakefield, has, from peculiar circumstances, aided by the spirited exertions of its inhabitants, become entitled to rank as the first town in the county, whether it be considered for the extent and population, or for its wealth and public spirit. To enumerate all the public institutions and buildings would be unnecessary. but amongst those which it does possess may be mentioned its gas lights, waterworks, and infirmary. To these and others will soon be added a public baths and a building preparing for the Philosophical Society lately established there. These observations upon the prosperity of a neighbouring town have not been called forth by envy or jealousy, but rather with a view to hold it up as an example worthy to be followed, and as proof of what may be accomplished by a little exertion and public spirit. So, what did the people of Wakefield do? They erected the public rooms, which are still there in the centre of Wakefield, containing an assembly room, a concert room, a newsroom, a library, and a dispensary. It's quite striking here that a dispensary was included. Since public buildings could be expensive, if you wanted to compete with your larger neighbours, building a multi-purpose building made good sense. Indeed, in certain respects, it made good sense whatever the size of the town. In addition to Wakefield, in the 1820s, multi-purpose buildings were erected in other towns. So here, for example, we have the new room in Halifax, opened in 1825, sadly demolished. The church next door to it is still there. It included a subscription library, a newsroom, an assembly room, and a billiard room. Sheffield did things on a rather grander scale. In 1825, it opened what was called the Music Hall, but in fact it included a concert room, a subscription library, a newsroom, plus a museum, laboratory, and lecture room for its literary and philosophical society. Bradford, in 1839, erected this building for its Mechanics Institute, financed by subscription again. But what of other facilities reflecting the comforts of life? Well, public baths, only public in the sense that if you were very affluent, you could get into them, erected these public baths at a cost of £7,000 in spa baths, really. Sheffield also erected its public baths, which opened in 1836. Though Sheffield had many imposing public buildings, it was conscious of the fact that it was rather slow off the mark in provision of buildings, and it was stated in the West Riding Directory of 1837, when talking about its facilities, it said, in particular its public baths, it said, "This useful and long-wanted bathing establishment is one of the best of the kind in the country, for though Sheffield is generally much later than other towns, it is usually amongst the most judicious in the construction of public buildings." Well, what about leisure facilities then beyond that? As I've said, Doncaster was a very important centre for racing. It's still my ambition to go to the St. Leger one day, and in the 1770s had erected this magnificent grandstand for its race meetings. Earlier in the century, it erected the Mansion House, which opened in 1748. It's a place you can go round, and its chandeliers cost more than the cost of the Moot Hall in Leeds. Splendid thing. And just on the left with the Ionic pillars, you see the betting room. All of this for the purpose of social gatherings for the rich and wealthy people who lived in the vicinity. Oh, and yes, Leeds too had a race ground, opened in 1824. Sadly, not as impressive as anything in Doncaster, and it really was very short-lived. But botanical gardens became the rage. Here are the splendid botanical gardens opened in Sheffield in 1836 on the Ecclesall Road. It's still there, thankfully. It's glass houses renovated. It's well worth going for a visit. Again, financed by purchase of shares. Leeds too had the Botanical Gardens, which opened in 1840. The Bear Pit survives there, owned by Leeds Civic Trust, but unfortunately the Botanical Gardens were swept away. With a lot of problems with body snatching in the 1830s, and of course the cemeteries of burial grounds of all these towns were under enormous pressure. Effectively, they were full. And therefore, if you were rich and affluent, you thought, well, we want to do something better than this. Therefore, you decided to, again, buy shares to finance the erection of what were private cemeteries. Here we see Leeds General Cemetery, which opened in 1835. £25 would get you in. Sheffield did even better in terms of appearance with the erection and creation of this wonderful cemetery, again on the Ecclesall Road. This is all on the southwest side of Sheffield. You can go and visit them today. Opened in 1836. I really liked this one, particularly because it had catacombs. Well, I'm at the end of my lecture. In conclusion, I wanted to return to education. For affluent people in the West Riding decided that there was a major gap in the provision of schools for their children. And they thought that by setting up companies, they could bridge the gap between the national and Lancastrian schools and the rather poor quality academies to provide good quality schools for the middle classes. And here we see rivalry rearing its head again. Sheffield Collegiate School, an Anglican school, was established, opened in 1836 for 120 boys. In competition, the Wesleyans erected the Wesleyan Proprietary College in Sheffield, opened in 1844. I mean, this looks like a stately home, doesn't it? It's very impressive and still stands in Sheffield as part of the King Edward VII School. This cost £24,000 and you could have 200 boarders. But my final slide is of the West Riding Proprietary School in Wakefield, which of course, as you can see, is still there. This was financed by £25 shares at a cost of over £5,000. Now, I chose this school as the last slide because I thought that the school symbolized one of the essential themes of my lecture. Underlying the rivalry between towns in the provision of buildings was the notion of civic pride. And to this could be added county pride. This building, the West Riding Proprietary School, was genuinely a West Riding institution in that it drew its shareholders from all over the West Riding, and indeed its pupils came from all over the West Riding. That the provision of public buildings could be a demonstration of pride in both town and county is clear from the words of Lord Morpeth when he opened this school. He said, "I am jealous for the success of everything which can redound to the credit of Yorkshire. I wish that it should lay behind in no department where honest praise can be attained." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Yet another really interesting lecture. And we've had quite a few questions come in. The first one, I think, is quite an easy one, is where was the House of Recovery in Leeds?
It was on Vicar Lane, more or less opposite Kirgate Market. So I'm not sure when it closed, it may indeed have been converted to a public house eventually, because of course, having your fever hospital, contagious diseases hospital in the heart of the town centre may have seemed a good idea in 1804, but of course, as the town grew and grew and got more congested, then clearly you wanted your isolation hospital out somewhere else.
Okay. And who was the contractor who built the Halifax Peace Hall?
Oh, now that is quite a complicated question. If I got my notes out, I could no doubt tell you who was the architect. But there is a very good book actually. If you go to Halifax Peace Hall, I'm sure you'd be able to buy it, which describes the building of the Peace Hall and the circumstances, including how it was built. It's a fascinating building in its own right for a whole variety of reasons.
All right, thank you. And then we've got 3 questions around the funding of these public buildings.
Yes.
First of all, the rivalry and the civic pride across towns and cities. Was that actually generated a bit to encourage people to buy shares, or was it genuine?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is you saw, I showed you that trust deed, I think, for the central market, where you see all the seals and all the names of people who had subscribed for shares. The fact was that, particularly in the 1820s, it was rather like a stock market boom in people felt that they were going to make a load of money out of putting these buildings up. And they believed, £50, I say, approximately the price you'd pay for a back-to-back house. So that if you were thinking about how you would invest your money, you'd hear that, lots of examples in this sort of comparison of what was happening in other places. A lot of the comments in the newspapers, and these were extensively talked about, were on the basis of, actually, a place like this has been erected in Newcastle or Manchester or Liverpool, and it's making a very good rate of return. So that they did, they were strongly encouraged to purchase shares because they thought they'd make a lot of money. In some cases, I spent hours and hours going through those trust deeds with all the names of people who'd subscribed, and people often bought, 4, 5, 6 shares in these things. The only one of them, of the Leeds 1820s buildings, that didn't do well was the South Market. And they decided that they could put it there and that they could make money by capturing people as they came in to go over Leeds Bridge, and that they go no further to make their purchases. In practice, it was considered to be just too out on a limb from the core of the shopping centre, and actually never made money. But in terms of rivalry, well, certainly, people, particularly in things like, should we say, the Philosophical Hall or institutions like that, there was a very strong element of saying, look, when our friends and neighbours and business people, or people who come from outside Leeds, come to Leeds and think, oh, look at this place, they haven't got this and they haven't got that, then there was a very strong sense that, apart from putting the money in, which of course, you'd be encouraged to do, particularly something like the Philosophical Hall, which wasn't a commercial venture in a sense, then it was very much, if Liverpool and Manchester have got these things, we must have them. But the thought that you're going to make money out of them was quite a strong incentive, and clearly people did.
It was mentioned about the public baths in Wellington Street that not everyone would gain entry, only the wealthy.
Yes.
Was it generally the rule that people funding public amenities would let everyone in, or not?
Well, of course, if you wanted to join the Philosophical Society, you'd have to subscribe. That's the first thing, and there's no doubt that with something like that, if you're working class, basically, probably you lack sufficient education to sort of want to go to the places, and also clearly you were expected to have money to be able to engage in its activities. Clearly markets and things like that, and to some extent maybe The cultural institution, sorry, the markets, yes, anybody could go in there. But if you took the public baths, were clearly, you were going to be restricted, a high subscription to become a member, high fees to go in, and frankly, you'd one way or another, you'd find it very difficult if you were genuinely working class and without means to actually get into them. So they were clearly, it's a bit like private health clubs and gyms in a sense. You've got to have money, but they were for the middle class people.
And the final question is, are wealthy people still influential today? I mean, it brings to mind the funding of the Playhouse and being a patron and having your name up on the wall. But I would imagine there's too much public funding to attract the wealthy investment from individuals.
Well, this is a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, clearly, cultural institutions in Leeds today do rely, okay, they get some public funding, but if you look down, for example, an Opera North programme, basically, Opera North does require, particularly for capital projects, does require a lot of money from relatively wealthy or affluent subscribers to help support their activities. And it's always been the case, charitable institutions of all sorts, do rely on, it's a combination. And some institutions attract lots of donations from people who are not well off. Think about the hospices in Leeds, for example, which clearly, do depend on lots of people across the city giving at times relatively small amounts. But there are certain types of institutions which are seen as to some extent elitist, and in those cases they're more likely to get money from wealthy people. And it's a very nuanced situation, really. But I think both now and then, I mean, clearly then, as you say, public money, from the government and the local authorities was very limited in the period. It changes, of course, in the Victorian period when local authorities start charging substantial rates and the population goes up, and the big institutions like museums, for example, art galleries, can be financed out of the public purse. But even then, it was common for big benefactors to make substantial donations for the benefit of the city. I mean, if you look at, I'm just thinking about present days, things like the Canal Gardens, for example, up at around here, very substantial donations from the Ziff family towards funding those facilities for the benefit of the people of the city. So it's a mixed picture, but it's a very interesting one.
Okay, well, thanks very much for today's talk. And thank you everyone for attending today. We look forward to seeing you again next week for the last of this series. And it's on Civic Pride Proclaimed, Leeds Town Hall, 1858 to 2022, as Leeds Town Hall and its wonderful organ are undergoing a major programme of renovation and remodelling. This lecture looks at the history of this remarkable building and its evolving use to the present day. So we'll all look forward to that next week, and it's goodbye from us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad people signed in to listen. So next week, yes, the town hall, the real demonstration of civic pride.
Okay, goodbye everyone.